There's a function on some Canon camera bodies that is incredibly powerful and useful, but most photographers haven't heard of it. I'm going to tell you all about register recall on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a question, you know what to do. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. If you're lucky, I just might pick your question to answer here on a future show. Reminder that I'm still holding my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshops in the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Europe this year. You get to join me backstage at a real concert, a real live concert, where I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about photographing concerts, sports, and really action of any kind. And then you get to shoot the entire show in an arena or a stadium that night. 30 cities are now on sale and a bunch are already sold out. So go to shootfromthepit.com for more info and to sign up right after you watch this video. Today's question was sent in by Scott W. and he wants to know, is there a way to program a button on the Canon R5 or R6 that will scroll through the custom settings? Those typically have to be selected by turning the mode dial on top of the camera. When covering basketball, I always miss a shot or two when I reach up and turn the dial to switch between custom settings. Can you help? Okay, so full disclosure, Scott's actual question was considerably longer than that, but I shortened it here for simplicity. He made reference to my video about a game-changing setting on the Canon cameras. I'm going to put a link in the description below to that video, but basically I showed how to program one of the back buttons for traditional autofocus and then another button for IAF. That way you can switch quickly between the two focus modes. Now, depending on what you're photographing, it can actually make the difference between getting the shot and missing it. Having those two buttons programmed separately makes a very huge difference. But in Scott's question, he said that what he has to do is switch his exposure very quickly when going from shooting the game action on the court to then photographing the players on the bench. Now, what he does to solve this is that he uses custom modes 1, 2, and 3 on his Canon R6. But you have to actually turn the dial on top of the camera to make that switch. The extra few seconds that it takes to make that change means that he misses a few shots. So he reached out and asked David Bergman for help. Well, Scott, I'm here to help you and every other photographer who wants to change settings very quickly. Now, there are actually two good ways to handle this. The first one works on any brand of camera. If you only need to change your exposure very quickly, I've already done a video about exactly this topic. If the light is changing very fast or you're shooting in differently lit areas like Scott is, then you can use what I jokingly call my Bergman brightness button. And I've developed this technique over many years shooting sports and concerts where the light is inconsistent and changes rapidly. I'm going to put a link to that video as well down in the description below, but the short version is that you shoot on manual exposure, and then you set 2 of your 3 settings on your exposure triangle, and then only use the third one to adjust your exposure as needed. Now, when I shoot concerts, and probably for Scott's basketball games as well, I'd say that you should lock your ISO, probably pretty high, right, because you're indoors for the most part, and then lock your aperture, probably shooting wide open, depending on the lens you're using, and then just use your forefinger to dial your shutter speed faster or slower to change your exposure. And if you're using a mirrorless camera, you'll even be able to see the exposure change in real time, and it's super easy to do this very, very quickly. Again, watch the video in the description for a more detailed explanation of how all that works. But there is one more way, and it's super cool. This one is only for those of you out there using modern Canon cameras. As a Canon shooter and an explorer of light, I don't really know the other systems as well, but I'm really curious if they have something like this. Let me know down in the comments if they do. But most of the newer Canon camera bodies have a little-known function that is incredibly powerful and helpful for so many situations just like this. It's called register recall. And here's how it works. You can register a whole bunch of settings in your camera and then recall those settings on a single button press. Now, I'm not only talking about exposure settings, but also metering modes, autofocus methods, and so much more. Now, let me show you how to make it work, and then I'll give you a few real-world examples of how you might actually use this in the field. The first thing you need to do is decide which button you want to use to activate the recall. In my case, like I said before, I already used the AF on button for traditional autofocus and then the star button next to it for eye autofocus. The Canon R5 also has a third button next to the star that's set to AF point selection by default. I don't really use that function, so it's perfect for me to use that for register recall. Of course, your situation might be different. Maybe you're not using back button focus, or you don't have a camera with as many buttons on the back. You just have to figure out what works best for you. This is all about customizing your setup for your own situation. But I'm going to go ahead and use that AF point selection button. Now, to program the button, you go into Customize Buttons and select the one you want to use. There are so many options in here, and they will be different depending on which camera you're using. On the R5, about halfway through all of these selections, you're going to see this icon that has a camera and an arrow going in on the left and an arrow going out on the right. You can see that it's called the Register Recall Shooting function. You hit Set to activate it, but also on the bottom left, you can see that it says Info Detail Set. That little button is where the magic happens. Press the Info button on your camera and it brings you behind the curtain of this amazing feature. Now, you can see here the list of all the functions you can register, and again, it'll be different depending on which Canon camera you're using. On the right, each function that you can set is listed. You can click on them individually using the Set button, and it's going to give you the appropriate options for each one. For example, when I select Shooting Mode, it brings up 4 distinct options: Program, TV, which is shutter priority or time value, AV or aperture priority, aperture value, and Manual. Let's select AV for this example. Now, there's one more thing you have to do to make this work. None of those functions are going to activate unless you put a check mark next to it to select it. So if you move over to the left of Shooting Mode and then click the Set button, it puts a check mark there. Now that function is active. So for this example, let's say you're shooting an event and normally you have your camera in full manual exposure mode. But maybe there's just one section of the location where you're shooting where the sun is hitting and your subject is walking in and out of that area. Just some random place like that. You maybe have a sunlight coming through the roof, right? If you program that button on aperture priority, when your subject gets into that light, just move your thumb over to that AF point selection button and press down. Now immediately you're in aperture priority mode and can shoot away. Now, one thing to be aware of, very importantly, is that the recall function only works while you're actively pressing down that button. So you hold down that button with your thumb, just like if you shoot back button focus, which I hope you do, and then press the shutter button with your forefinger to take pictures at the same time. Once you lift your thumb off of that button, it goes back to however your camera was set, which in this case was manual exposure at the same settings you had before. So think of it this way. It's just a temporary switch that's super fast. Now, you can add in as many of the other functions as you want, and pressing the thumb button will recall all of those settings at the same time. So maybe you want to keep it on manual exposure instead of going to aperture priority, but you want to change all 3 of your exposure triangle settings. Just register all of them, make sure that they're checked, and then no matter what exposure mode or setting you're on, when you push the programmed button, it's going to immediately go to manual exposure at the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO you registered. And then you can just shoot away until you lift your finger off that button, and it's going to go right back to where you were before. And look, I've only scratched the surface of what you can do here. On the R5, you can set metering modes. Maybe you want to temporarily switch to spot metering, but not necessarily shoot that way the whole time. You've also got exposure compensation, white balance, autofocus method, tracking sensitivity, acceleration and deceleration tracking, and AF operation on or off. That last one basically tells the camera if you want to use back button focus. If that's set to on and you're in AI servo, for example, you'll be actively focusing on your subject while recalling all of those other settings. If you have it set to off, then pushing that button is not going to activate the AF motors, and you'll have to use your shutter button to do that. I'm personally not a fan of shooting that way. I use back button focus all the time, but you can set it up however works best for you. Now, by the way, if you're only interested in changing one setting with the other button, then register recall really might be overkill. If you think about my setup with the star button for eye autofocus, I could set up that star button using register recall, but I've chosen to simply use the metering and AF start setting and then going into detail set to program that for IAF. Register recall is really used best when you want to temporarily change multiple settings all at once. I'm going to give you some more real-world examples to hopefully get your brain going on how to use this. Let's say you're a car racing photographer. You shoot on manual exposure, use back button focus, and use a very fast shutter speed of maybe 4,000th of a second to freeze the cars as they pass by you. But once in a while, you'd like to shoot a panning shot of one or two cars. That requires a slow shutter speed. So you can set the register recall function to change your shutter down to whatever you want, maybe 125th of a second, while also changing your aperture and shutter speed to the best settings so the shutter change doesn't mess up your exposure. Or maybe you prefer to shoot shutter priority at 1/25th of a second. You can also change your focus mode from a small area, since you're normally trying to focus on the driver, to a wider area autofocus mode, so you just pick up the entire car. Point is, as cars are going by, you can choose in the blink of an eye if you want to freeze the action of that particular car or instead shoot a panning motion blur shot just by pushing a different button with your thumb. It's really that easy, folks. Or maybe you're a wildlife photographer and the birds you're trying to photograph are flying through the air in direct sunlight, but then when they land, their nest is in a much darker area in shadow. You can switch exposure focus modes very easily. With the Canon R5, you can even quickly switch from person eye detection to animal eye detection. Whatever it is you need to do, you can program it, most of it, to that button. Pretty cool stuff. Now, as you can see, register recall is an incredibly powerful function that I don't think many people know about. I'm not sure exactly when Canon added it, but it's in the R3, the R5, and the R6. Those I've checked myself. I also looked at my older cameras and can confirm it's also in the 1DX Mark III and the 5D Mark IV. I'm pretty sure it's in older cameras than that, but go ahead and check the manual or check your own cameras just to be sure. Register recall is different than switching between custom modes 1, 2, and 3. Those are a collection of settings that you select and pretty much keep it that way for a while. If you sometimes shoot portraits and then on other days you shoot landscapes, you might have a completely different grouping of settings that you use for each of those types of shooting. At the beginning of the shoot, all you have to do is simply choose the appropriate custom mode and you're good to go for the day. Register recall is really just something you program to a button for that quick, temporary change. Scott, I think that function or my Bergman brightness button is going to solve your problem. What about everyone else out there? If you're a Canon shooter, did you know that this even existed? Will you use it now that you do know? Let me know how in the comments below. Also, as I said, if you're using another brand of camera, let me know if there's something similar, as I'm actually really curious. I wish every system would have this kind of programmability, as it can be really helpful when used properly. Hey, do me a favor, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that little bell icon so you'll get notifications all week long from myself and the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Check out my Shoot from the Pit workshops, and I hope to see you on the road this year. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next time with another question right here on Ask David Bergman.